All right, so we are now looking at chapter 21 and the water and electrolyte balance. Now, balance really, it says here, balance suggests a state of consistency. Really, it is the perfect definition for homeostasis. It's a balance of trying to keep things in order. Our body is mainly water. 2/3 of our body roughly is water. And so that's a big deal, making sure it's right. And again, if it gets off on either side or the other, it's going to upset the osmotic balance. And electrolytes. The electrolytes are super important because that's what most everything functions by. Again, going back to 210, you should remember that all nerve impulses require a dance between sodium and potassium. Calcium is at the end of that, at the synaptic knob, as well as all muscle contraction. The calcium is the trigger that starts it. So they are super important to be in order and in the right amount. So balance is maintained by mechanisms that replace the water that we lose in electrolytes and that we get rid of, but we also get rid of the excess, as it says, and excrete the excess. So this is a big thing, and the kidneys are one of the major areas, again, of the water balance and electrolytes too. So this is a big deal. Now we start with this just to kind of give you a refresher. This chapter is really kind of putting a bunch of stuff that we have learned earlier. Unfortunately, a lot of it is in 210, and just kind of remind you of and put it in order. So body fluids are not equally distributed, and that's where osmosis comes in. That's why we need to make the osmosis, keep it correct, because it's not evenly distributed, but we need to have a good concentration, because remember, water is going to move from high concentration to low concentration to try and even things out. Or low concentration to high concentration, excuse me, said that backwards. Water and electrolyte movement between these compartments is regulated to stabilize their distribution and the composition of body fluids. This just kind of goes over it. Again, I don't know that I'm going to, this isn't a big thing. Understand that our body is about 2/3 water. Regardless of what it says here, I'm not worried about this. I don't want this to upset anyone. Males and females don't have the same amount of water. It says here females have a little more adipose tissue, which is low in water. Males have more muscle, which is high in water. This is not going to be a question on the test or anything. I'm not even worried about the number of liters of water. But what I do want you to know is how the water is divided. We have intracellular fluid, which means inter is the fluid inside the body cells. This is about where 63% of all the water is. Again, it kind of shows it here divided up. And then the extracellular fluid, the fluid that is outside the cells. That's only about 37, or it's basically 60-40 almost is the dividing line. Now, the extracellular, the fluid that is outside of the body. Okay, so on this little graph down at the bottom, this goes back to, this is the amount of water that is inside the cells. And then the water that is outside the cells is divided up in a couple different areas. We have what is called interstitial fluid. This is just the fluid that is in between the cells, right? It is in the tissue spaces. We have blood plasma and lymph. Again, they're kind of cousins to each other, right? They're the fluid that's inside those vessels. And then we have something called transcellular fluid. This is simply, like we looked at the eye, right? The eye, and how we had the iris up here and whatever, and you had a posterior, and there's a lens back here. So we had a posterior and an anterior cavity. And you remember, I'm sure you remember all of this, that the posterior cavity is filled with vitreous humor, the anterior is filled with aqueous humor. Those type of things. Well, that is what is called transcellular. It's just things that are in compartments. CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, The serous fluid that is in the joint, or the synovial fluid that's in the joints, the serous fluid that's between the parietal and visceral membranes. Transcellular just simply means the fluid that's in different compartments. And as you can see, the interstitial fluid, the fluid of the tissues, is the largest section of this. Now, this is another thing that, again, I know that some of you might be listening to this thinking, why do we have to know this? But you should already know this. The extracellular fluids, the fluid on the outside of the cell, the main one that I want you to know is sodium. Intracellular, the fluid that is inside the cell, the main one I want you to know is potassium. And you should already know that, because when we talked about nerve impulses in 210, you had potassium inside the cell and you had sodium on the outside. And the sodium had to come in, and then the potassium was pushed out. And that's how we had that little action potential that worked its way down, because it disrupted the charge on it. So I do want you to know those. Sodium is the major one that's on the outside of cells, and you can kind of see, this gives a little graph here, and the potassium is the one that is inside of cells. This picture is just showing how this water, this fluid moves all around. So this was the capillary bed here. So we had the capillary bed, we had plasma that got pushed out by hydrostatic pressure, and then you remember it gets pulled back in by osmosis. But when it is pushed out, it becomes interstitial fluid, because now it's in the little spaces. That fluid is going to bring oxygen into the cells, and at that point it is intracellular fluid, but then it's also going to be pushed out as those cells get rid of all of their waste products. And then that interstitial fluid is going to do two things. One of it's going to be pulled back into the circulatory system by osmosis, and then the other one, the pressure is going to push it in, and now it is lymph. So they're all interconnected. It's not like each part is just completely separate. Even the transcellular fluid of like the vitreous and the aqueous humor and the synovial fluid that's in the joints, they're going to be made up of basically the same fluid that goes from the plasma to the interstitial fluid and then into these openings. So again, most fluid movement results in changes in osmotic pressure. That's what's going to be driving most of this stuff outside of the usual hydrostatic pressure, the pressure of the fluid. Water balance exists when water intake, and which is also the metabolic production, equals water output. That is a balance. I mean, that, anytime input equals output in anything, that's balance. So homeostasis requires control of both water intake and output. Water intake controlled by these thirst centers we're going to talk about in the brain, and then water output is mainly controlled by the kidneys. So when we look at this graph, and again, this is going to be, we're going to actually talk about this part of the graph a little later on. This one is talking about intake of water. Most of the water we're going to get from what we drink. Another pretty large part is what we eat. We might not think of it, but foods have a lot of water in it, a lot more than we would think that they do. But there's another part, about 10% of all the water that is created and kind of put into our body is actually a part of metabolism. Carbon dioxide, or let's see if I can draw this, C6H12O6. This is glucose. When it is in the presence of oxygen, it gets broken down into CO2 and water, H2O plus ATP. That's a bad drawing. But anyway, so a big part of the whole breakdown of this molecule that we call glucose is water. That's why we breathe in oxygen and then we breathe out carbon dioxide and water. And we'll see that that's another loss again here on this, just skipping ahead. A pretty big percent, 28% of all the water loss is done either through the skin, which is sweating, which is a large part of it, or the lungs. We actually breathe out about a 12-ounce can, equivalent of what would be a 12-ounce can of water every day. So anyway, that's where a big part of the water that we're putting in is coming from this. Now, even though we are going to breathe it out, a lot of it out. But the majority, again, is what we drink. And that's why the thirst of it. So the body loses as little as 1% of its water, but if it changes, it can be a big deal. And what happens is, if the osmotic pressure of the extracellular fluid increases, and this is due to water loss, and I'm not worried about you knowing that it increases or decreases. That gets into a lot more stuff. Just know it's the osmotic pressure that's going to change. And they're going to send a signal to the hypothalamus. You do need to know the hypothalamus is the area where your thirst center is located. And when the hypothalamus gets stimulated, it's going to cause you to feel thirsty and you will seek water. As we drink, the muscles of the stomach are going to be stimulated, and it will tell the thirst center that we're good, and it'll cause it to slow down. The water is going to be absorbed through the stomach and the small intestines, and then as the osmotic pressure returns to normal, it will then go back and calm the hypothalamus. So it's a big cycle. And as it says here, the primary regulator of water intake is our thirst. Now, we usually drink our water. I mean, I can't think of many other ways that we take it in. Excuse me while I take a drink of water. Our water output is about 2.5 liters a day. Again, that varies tremendously, but it should equal the water intake, or very close to it. Now, our water loss, most of that is going to be through urine. All right, what we just talked about with the kidneys. But there's a small percentage that's lost in feces. There's a small percentage that is lost in sweat. But again, there's a pretty big amount that's lost through just, it says insensible perspiration, which just means we're constantly radiating water away. And then the breathing out that we do every day. Water vapor is going to be released in our breath. Now, water output varies on temperature, humidity, and activity level. I mean, this one should be, really understood. I'm going to have to go out and cut the grass before too long, and I'm going to sweat because I'm going to be more active than just sitting here doing these videos. Now, this kind of compares either low water, dehydration, or high water. If we don't have enough, the osmoticality, I don't know how to say that word, but you know what I'm saying, is going to change. And then these osmoreceptors are going to go to the hypothalamus and say, hey, we need to put more water in it. The hypothalamus is going to send a signal to the posterior pituitary gland that's going to release ADH, and we talked about this in the kidneys. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, to the blood. The ADH goes to the kidneys, particularly the distal convoluted tubule, and it is going to increase water reabsorption. I am thirsty. I need water. I'm dehydrated. I need water. I'm going to be thirsty. But the other thing is, it's going to go to the kidneys and it's going to say, hey, pull all the water you can back in, because I don't want to pee it out at that time. At this, we're going to make concentrated urine. Excess water intake, the extracellular fluid, is going to change osmotically. There we go. I think I got it that time. The change stimulates the hypothalamus. It's going to send a signal to the posterior pituitary gland to decrease ADH results. Therefore, the distal convoluted tubule will decrease water reabsorption. Urine output increases and excess water is excreted. So if you're out drinking and you're drinking beer and you're drinking a lot of it, you're going to have to go to the bathroom a lot because your body's going to recognize that there's too much fluid. And if you don't, it is going to be a really big problem. The osmoreceptor ADH mechanism is in the hypothalamus. It regulates the concentration of urine produced by the kidneys. So ADH levels are constantly going to rise and lower, rise and lower. So as I have more fluid in my body, I'm going to produce more, or I have less fluid in my body, I'm going to produce more ADH, and our body's going to conserve water. As I have more water in my body, I'm going to produce less ADH, and I'm going to pee out more water. So it's changing back and forth. Now, just to say, we're not going to get into this right now, but ADH is what is the key for what we call diabetes insipidus, which is different than diabetes mellitus. But that's the cause of it, is ADH issues. So the electrolytes, so we're talking about water all up to there, but the electrolytes are a big thing, and they're going to kind of follow water. We're going to get electrolytes. We're going to take it in from the foods we eat, the things we drink, and then also there will be some that are going to be produced in the different metabolic reactions. They are all going to be going into increasing the electrolyte content in my body. As the electrolyte content increases, there's going to be a need to get rid of some of it. Some of it's going to go in perspiration as we sweat, some of it in our feces, and then the majority of it is actually the urine because it's the biggest water output, so it's also the biggest electrolyte output. Now, the most important electrolytes for cellular functions are going to be, and I'm going to tell you, these are the big three. Now, all of these are important. Again, I don't want to overlook the bicarbonate here, hydrogen ions. This is all about pH, and so it is super important. But for us right now, I'm going to say let's just stick with the big three here. Calcium is needed for not only nerve conduction, but muscle contraction. And then these right here are really the main ones in nerve conduction. And again, calcium is going to be the end result of the action potential because it's going to be what enters into the synaptic knob to cause release of the neurotransmitter. All right, so most of these are going to be obtained through foods. And so, that's the main way. We've got to, especially like calcium, we have to understand how much calcium is on our diet because, again, like we looked at and like I'm going to show here in just a little bit, calcium's tightly regulated because of the need of it for the nervous system and the muscular system, particularly your cardiac muscle, because if that stops, that's a problem. So usually a person obtains sufficient electrolytes by responding to hunger and thirst. He'll tell us what we do. And when you have cravings, like it says, severe electrolyte deficiency might cause salt craving. But there's all kinds of them. People, like little kids that eat mud patties. That's a big thing, especially in third world countries, because they have deficiencies in their electrolytes and their ions, things that they need. So they'll be eating weird things because they'll have these cravings for it. Now, some electrolytes are lost by perspiring, obviously more on warmer days and during strenuous exercise. Again, this should, and I might not be able to spell it, this should say duh, because, that just should be made without, hey, a little heart. That should just be common sense. Now, one of the things about perspiring, while it's not the most, it's not the greatest, it says here, the greatest electrolyte output as a result of urine production, but perspiring is probably the most concentrated. And that's why if you're doing something and you're sweating a lot, you actually need more than just water. This is why, like, Gatorade or Powerade is very good. And all it is they put some sugar and salt in the water, put a little flavoring, and then charge you a lot more for it. That's why it says, it's packed with electrolytes, or, it's like, all they're saying is they put sugar and salt in it. But on the flip side of that, if you drink Gatorade or Powerade when you're not sweating, That's not good for you. Do not do that. It really isn't a good health drink. When I had my office, I used to have people come in all the time that would kind of talk about how they would give their kids Gatorade because it was a health drink. And I'm like, no, that's such a problem. But anyway, I'm not going to get down that path. The kidneys regulate the composition of body fluids and maintain homeostasis by adjusting electrolyte losses in the urine. The kidneys are the regulator. They're the ones that are kind of monitoring things and doing the heavy lifting. So regulation of electrolyte output, these big three are of, as it says, particular importance. These ions are vital for nerve impulse concentration, muscle fiber contraction, and the maintenance of cell membrane permeability. These are big. Potassium maintains resting membrane potential in nerves and cardiac muscle. Sodium accounts for 90% of all the positively charged ions in the extracellular fluid. It is super important. Now, we probably eat too much salt, but salt is a very necessary thing. The hormone aldosterone is all about sodium and ion balance. Now, it really is about sodium, right? We want to make sure of this. Now, and we're going to talk about this when I start putting together the endocrine system, but there is just a brief little thing, and I don't want to get too far into this, but there used to be a TV show called Happy Days. If you are familiar with Happy Days, you'll understand. And it wasn't a great show. I don't want it to sound like it was. The first couple of years were pretty funny, but then it really was bad. Anyway, they would hang out at a place called Al's Diner. Big Al. And so when I was in school, I could always remember that aldosterone worked on sodium because diners are famous for two things: greasy food and high salt concentration. So I could remember aldosterone worked on sodium. So the high potassium concentration stimulates the secretion of aldosterone, which increases reabsorption of sodium and tubular secretion of potassium. It really is going to, again, this is the key. The potassium is just kind of the counterpart. Now, this is the one I'm going to talk about in just a second. I'm going to go to one of these blank slides and do some drawing. How our body regulates calcium ions. I can't remember if I went over with you about this, so I'm going to take some time to really do this. This is big I know if you had me in 210, I definitely went over this in the skeletal system. Now, the negative ions, particularly chloride, this is going to move and just follow the movement of sodium because they're attracted like little magnets. So this is the blank page I was talking about. And so I'm going to just kind of briefly mention the way that our body regulates calcium levels. Now, there are three things that we need to know. Two of them are glands, and the other two things are their hormones. Now, again, it's tough to spell all of this stuff here, but I will tell you that there are three that are tied together pretty intimately. And I'm going to just use the simple word thyroid. I'm not going to spell all of this out. Oop, sorry, that was a bad. The thyroid. And if you can remember thyroid, you should be able to remember its counterpart that works with it for it. And it is called parathyroid. And I'm just going to put parathyroid, PT, and then I'm going to put gland. So these are glands. All right. Now, if you can remember the thyroid and parathyroid, which you should because they've got a common word in it, thyroid and parathyroid, you should be able to remember the hormone that the parathyroid gland secretes because it is named parathyroid hormone. And it only produces one hormone. So by knowing and remembering one thing, thyroid, you should be able to remember and tie together all three things. Thyroid and parathyroid hormone are what are going to be used to regulate calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone is released by the parathyroid gland. Now, the thing about this one that doesn't play well with that whole naming system, it is what I like to call the Rosetta Stone. It is what sets everything in place. It is called calcitonin. And bear with me here. Calcitonin. And the thing about calcitonin is it puts calcium into bone. Calcitonin puts calcium into bone. Calcitonin puts calcium into bone. So if I'm sitting here and I've got a little skeleton, and I've got a little skeleton here. Oh, that was a bad one. And the skeleton has bones that are storing calcium. I've got a set point, and then I'm going to have this little seesaw. If calcium gets too high in my blood, because I want to bring it down to normal, right? I want to bring it back down to normal. I'm going to take calcium and I'm going to store it into bone. I'm going to put calcium into my bones. So if I have on the opposite side calcium that is too low and I need to bring it up, what I'm going to do is take the calcium out of my bones and put it into my circulatory system. So since I know calcitonin puts calcium into bone, I know it's on this side of things because I'm taking calcium that is in excess and I'm going to put it into my bones. Now, also at the other point in time, I'm going to cause my kidneys to not really worry about calcium, and so I'm going to pee it out. All right. Now, to put it another way, thyroid gland is going to be stimulated when I have high levels of calcium in my bloodstream. It will release calcitonin, which will cause osteoblasts, right, to be activated and build bone. On the other hand, since I know these two are opposite, if I have low blood calcium, the parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate it. It's going to be stimulated to secrete parathyroid hormone. I probably messed that up. Parathyroid gland is going to be stimulated to secrete parathyroid hormone. It will activate osteoclasts, which their job is to break down bone, and in turn, calcium is released and put into the bloodstream, and it raises my blood level. So again, there's a real easy way to remember this whole cycle. There are four things. We've got thyroid and parathyroid glands. Parathyroid gland secretes parathyroid hormone. So three of the four are pretty much tied to that name. The one that doesn't play well with it is called calcitonin. Calcitonin puts calcium into bone. So calcitonin is secreted. If I have high blood calcium, it's going to lower my blood calcium level by taking it from the blood, putting it in bone by stimulating osteoblasts. Now, the other thing that I kind of left off here, and I shouldn't have, on this side, if I have low blood calcium levels, not only is the parathyroid gland going to secrete parathyroid hormone that stimulates osteoclasts to release the calcium, it's also going to go to my kidneys, and it's going to go specifically to that little area. We got the glomerulus here, the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct. It's going to go to this area of the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct, and every time it sees calcium, it's going to pull it out and put it back into the bloodstream, tubular reabsorption. So I hope that makes sense. Now, this little graph I'm not worried about, but if you can look at it and follow it along, when I'm looking at it, I can see what it's talking about. It's not necessarily the clearest thing, but it is a pretty good flow chart in a way. But make sure when you're looking at it that you're following. Plasma calcium concentration decreases. We said that if it decreases, that is parathyroid. Parathyroid gland is going to secrete parathyroid hormone. Since we know that calcitonin puts calcium into bone, we know parathyroid hormone takes it out of bone. So it's going to activate osteoclasts, which are going to go and create calcium ions. Parathyroid hormone is also going to cause the intestine to increase calcium ion uptake, which is going to increase ion levels. It's going to go to the renal tubules, particularly the distal convoluted tubules, and cause calcium ion uptake. And it's also going to, now see what happens here, calcium in bone is called calcium phosphate, right? And so when we're released, we want to absorb the calcium, but we need to get rid of phosphate. And so that's how the parathyroid hormone is working. I hope that makes sense. This isn't going to be a huge part of the test, but this is meant you've got to be able to, you shouldn't have forgotten things. And you've got to be able to tie things that you have remembered together to put it in use.